Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the second session. In this session, we'll be talking about trade and North American trade and integration. As we know, Dallas, especially here at the Dallas Fed, we like to pride ourselves as being the capital of North America, as Jim said last night. And this is the original center of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in a way, to commemorate that and recognize that, but also to emphasize the continuing importance of that, of our trilateral relationship, we have a fantastic panel here today. And I'm actually going to be introducing them. The full bios, of course, are in your programs, but we'll be going from north to south, and starting with Eugene Beaulieu, who's a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Calgary, who completed his PhD at Columbia University, and he's served as an advisor at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and serves on the International Trade Advisory Committee as Statistics Canada. And it's definitely, whenever I think of a leading Canadian expert on trade and labor, Eugene's always the first one to come to mind. So I'm going to introduce all three, and then we'll go. And then after that, we'll move farther south down to Iowa, to Hâle Utar, who's the Sidney Meyer Endowed Chair of International Economics at Grinnell College, which is one of our leading undergraduate institutions as an associate professor. She's a research fellow at the IZA and a member of CES Info, an associate editor at the Review of International Economics, and she got her PhD in economics from Pennsylvania State University. And then farther south, we'll conclude with Manuel Sanchez, who's very well known to this audience, who's a good friend of these events. We like to see him often here. And he's a Mexican economist with a wide-ranging professional career that includes positions in banking, central banking, and academics. He was previously the Director General and Center for Economic Analysis and Research at the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico, and got his master's and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He's one of the Chicago boys in that sense. But we'll definitely start with, at the north, with Eugene. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. It's great to be back in Texas. I think it's, so how do I find my slides? I think it's important just, again, this is a North American session, but I am going to emphasize the importance of having all three countries. And, you know, often it's useful and important to have bilateral discussions, but it's also really important to keep in mind that the North America aspect of this, and that came up a little bit in the previous session. I'm going to emphasize it a little bit more. You can hear me okay? Okay. So I do think it's important to have all three countries here. And I'm going to focus quite a bit more on Canada and Canada, US, Mexico. But I am going to stress the North American, the trilateral nature of this. And I'm going to focus on making arguments that theory and empirical analysis are crucial for good policy. And we need to keep that in mind. I think that's an easy sell in this audience, but I think it's super important. I think we have to keep that in mind and keep pushing forward with that. I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to go and do a historical presentation on how we got to where we are. And I'll finish off at the so-called USMCA. I really liked Laura's comment on what happened to North America. I mean, I would probably prefer to call it NAFTA too as well, but it's called USMCA in this country. I'll talk a little bit about that and just some concerns I have with it, and then I'll conclude. So the history, Canada-US free trade, I don't know if you can see the image behind the notes very well, but that's a Canadian Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, and Lyndon Johnson. And they, before we had CUSTA, and again, Laura mentioned this, the Auto Pact, probably most people, I'm kind of surprised she mentioned it because I think most people forget about the Auto Pact. But the Auto Pact is important, and it's an important part of this story because this was economic theory and economic empiricism in action. It was just a recognition that there's increasing returns to scale and that the auto sector could benefit from having an agreement. I probably should point out that in particular the Canadian auto industry could benefit, but definitely it was a North American, it was an integration of Canada-US auto sector, and that was a transformative agreement, and it really was a textbook application of economic theory and empiricism that led to this auto pact. And then I'll draw a line from auto pact directly to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and then we'll get into NAFTA. So these are two Canadian economists, Ron and Tom Wonnacott, or Paul Wonnacott. They're two Canadian economists who studied the auto sector, and they have a textbook. This is a textbook case of increasing returns to scale, and they argued that, you know, so that's the downward sloping average cost curve. They looked at engineering studies that said the minimum efficient plant size. This is in the 1960s, was 600,000 autos produced. The U.S. was producing something like 300,000 per plant, and Canada was way up the average cost curve because we had a small economy, we had high tariffs on cars, so Canadian consumers were paying high prices. We were paying high prices, and we had very little in terms of variety of goods. So this was kind of the argument for the auto pact. The Wonnacotts were there. There was other economists. There's a white paper, an important document that pushed policy forward by Bladen, and the results were there. We had specialization in production, increased production, exports. We came down the Canadian auto industry came down the average cost curve, and economies of scale were achieved. Consumers benefited from having more variety. Canadian firms and U.S. Automakers located in Canada and U.S. automakers located in the U.S. at the time all benefited from the larger market size and the specialization and rationalization that occurred. So that was the auto pact, and I'm going to draw a line from Lyndon Johnson and Pearson. They actually, I think they signed the auto pact in Texas, so I'm pretty sure it happened there. They didn't like each other. I don't know if you could tell from that picture. They weren't very friendly, but there's a line between them and Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney that they were friendly with each other, and they wanted to sign a free trade agreement. But I'm going to argue that the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was directly a result of revolutionary changes in trade theory and empiricism that showed that the Canadian government that they should sign a free trade agreement with the U.S. So they pushed for it. We got the agreement, and then we'll talk about the next step after that. So again, what the Wonnacotts talked about and what Bladen talked about was increasing returns to scale in one industry, a partial equilibrium model. At the time, there was no general equilibrium presentation of increasing returns to scale. It was inconsistent with the models we had. So if you did an analysis of a Canada-US Free Trade Agreement before Krugman's work, the returns were very small. We had constant returns to scale. Krugman's path-breaking work that he won a Nobel Prize for, I love the Nobel Prize Committee citation, which refers to the auto sector, and it's talking about Sweden, but it's talking about two-way trade in autos and the benefits of having lower prices and greater variety of products and benefiting from scale economies. So at the time, the new trade theory was an important theoretical development, but what's I think most remarkable is that two Canadian economists took Krugman's theory and they quantified it and they put it into a Canadian general equilibrium model or a Canada-US general equilibrium model, a computable general equilibrium model. And they showed that basically what they showed to policymakers in Ottawa, again, at the time, Ottawa was protectionist. Ottawa was probably you could argue there was anti-Americanism in Ottawa, definitely not strong, but it was there, and it was protectionist. And Harris and Cox showed that the gains from trade, by including increasing returns to scale in the monopolistic competition model that Krugman developed, that the gains wouldn't be less than 1% of GDP with a free trade agreement. They would be more in the order of magnitude of 8% of GDP with a free trade agreement. So I cite this McDonald Commission because what happened at the time was Pierre Trudeau commissioned a study what can Canada do in the future? How can we maintain or increase our economy, and how can we prosper? And the key answer from volumes of papers, this McDonald Commission, there's stacks of studies that were done. The one takeaway from that commission report was sign a free trade agreement with the United States. And that was from Harrison Cox's work. It was the clear recommendation from the McDonald Commission. And I think importantly, the government changed from Trudeau to Mulroney, and Mulroney took this commission report and embraced it. And when he met Reagan in Quebec City and they sang When Irish Eyes Are Smiling on the stage in Quebec City, they agreed to sign a free trade agreement. But it wasn't just because they liked each other and got along. It was because of the economics won. Economics presented the theory, they presented the empiricism, and Ottawa in particular bought into it. Obviously there was more that happened, but those are the key pieces. So just again, we have a line from Wanicutt's work in the auto sector, partial equilibrium analysis. We have evidence that this actually worked. In the auto sector, we had integration, we had scale economies, we had increased variety and lower costs. And then we had the expansion of the theory from one sector to the whole economy. And the work by Harris and Cox that showed that this would directly benefit Canada in particular. It also showed the US would benefit from these scale economies in this trade agreement. But it was a key conclusion of the McDonald Commission, and it led directly to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Okay, so then let's move on to NAFTA. And again, this was a landmark, this was a game-changing trade deal. And it was, I mean, as we know, so important to bring Mexico into it. But this was a big deal, it was a big change, bringing in a developing economy into two developed economy trade agreement. But it was arguably incredibly successful. Again, focus on lowering tariffs and expansion of trade. This happened it's pretty clear that we had massive expansion of trade and deep integration of the North American economy. We saw some evidence of that in the presentations before. I think some of that integration, especially on the Mexico side, we saw again some of that this morning, that was a little bit delayed because NAFTA only had a 7-year head start. And even China was already emerging, but after 2001, China just kind of takes over. But, what would have been the effect on Mexico of China emerging like that if we didn't have NAFTA? There's an important piece of the trade agreement that is worth highlighting, and that's the dispute settlement mechanism. And that was something that Canada wanted, and again, if you read the history of the agreement, that was the 11th hour, I guess, big win for Canada, getting a dispute settlement mechanism. And then, as we know, the labor and environmental safeguards or side agreements. I guess in today's day and age, that was a bit of a fail, but a success that we got it in. But it didn't have any teeth. It wasn't effective. So I think if you look at the new agreement, we have environment and labor in there, directly in there and purposefully in there. So there was an explosion of trade, integration of the three economies, but probably NAFTA hasn't been as successful in the eyes of the U.S. public and politically as it has been in Canada for sure, and I would argue in Mexico as well, that NAFTA is seen as a success in these countries. So I'll just show you a couple slides of, tariffs came down, the blue lines are the tariff rates, the solid line is the US tariff rate. So you can see that, and for Canada it's the dots, and Mexico it's the dashes. So tariffs had already come down because of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. They were already relatively low between the two countries. They came down even more. And then for Mexico, it was a bit higher, but that after the trade agreement, they came down. And the trade expansion is there. This is another way to look at it. This is comparing trade before, bilateral trade before, or NAFTA trade before before the agreements to after the agreements. And the blue line is before, the combined greens are the after, and the darker green is comparing, or is taking into account economic growth. So some fraction of that growth in trade was because of GDP growth, but a lot of it had to do with the liberalization of tariffs. So I haven't talked about investment. I mean, that also increased. We do have deep integration in these economies. I think it's important and useful to point out that NAFTA does come from evidence-based policy, evidence and theory-based, and it had bipartisan support. Especially in United States and Canada, it was a bipartisan agreement. And I focused on trade, but obviously investment was also part of that. It fundamentally reshaped our economies, and we have unprecedented integration in the region. Again, still criticized in the US, and even in Canada, occasionally during election campaigns, NAFTA would be targeted as a scapegoat for things that ailed the economy. But in the US, it was stronger, to the point that President Trump called it the worst trade deal ever made and vowed to tear it up. And as president, really did force the renegotiation. So one thing that's really important is that NAFTA absolutely needed to be updated, it needed to be expanded, and it needed to focus on pieces of the economy that weren't there before. I think it was really vital to update and upgrade NAFTA. So I just listed a couple of things that were brought in. You know, customs procedures, simplifying trade, state-owned enterprises. I think a crucial piece of the new agreement is the competitiveness agenda and bringing that into the discussion, and also the regulatory practices and attempts to deal with it and technical barriers to trade. So those kind of tend to be a bit boring, but those are important. I think an important piece of the change was increasing regional value content. So that's going from making sure that autos had 62% made in North America to 75%. And this is where I start wondering how much evidence and how much careful thought was put into this. I understand the political and possible arguments for increasing the share, but if we want a competitive auto sector, we should be sourcing parts more globally. And maybe it makes sense to source them within North America, but to mandate it in the agreement, I think we're getting a little bit away from free trade and getting more and more managed trade, which again, some of these agreements already have, but I think USMCA is very much managed trade, especially when you start talking about making sure that steel and aluminum is 70% North America sourced. And then the value of making sure that that production is coming from plants where workers are paid $16 per hour. Again, that seems like maybe we're not going to achieve the goals we think we are there, and maybe it's going to hurt the integration process or the trade process. And then I'll just finish up with, Laura touched on this morning too, calling it NAFTA 2. I think it's 100% political that North America is no longer in the title. All three countries have their own titles for this agreement. I think it should have stayed as a North America agreement. It really is what it is, and that's important. And actually, the failure of NAFTA was in not, I think, making it clear the benefits of this integration of having a North American economy. So, there's one other aspect of the USMCA that concerns Canadians, I would say, or at least this Canadian, and that's carve-outs on U.S. protectionism, things like Section 232, that we did have carve-outs for that under NAFTA. We don't under USMCA. So just let me conclude. A shortcoming of NAFTA, I think, was that we probably didn't sell it, I guess, or the evidence in the U.S. Maybe well, first of all, it's less clear that NAFTA had the positive effects in the US that it did in Canada and Mexico. The evidence is less clear in the US. The US is just a much larger economy, and it's just not as clear that the benefits are there. But I think the benefits are there. I have a key concern with the sunset clause, and I'm worried that it's going to create a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And so, I mean, 16 years seems like a long time. It's not that long in trade policy. We went from having no sunset clause to having a sunset clause. This could put a chill on investment. We have to have a review in the next 2 years, so we can just imagine what that might look like. Again, as trade policy has become more politicized, less bipartisan, this is an issue, and having a sunset clause is an issue, and so that's a big concern I have. And I do think this agreement became more political and less based in economic theory and evidence, and that's a bit of a problem. But that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Continuing on our journey south, we'll go down and have Hâle Utar come up.
And let me start by saying thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this amazing group. So my talk is going to be based on my co-authored work with Luis Torres-Ruiz, who is also in the audience, and Alfonso Sebreros Zurita. So I would like to talk about more generally the role of US-China trade in shaping global value chain activities in Mexico and affecting Mexico's trade-oriented development strategies and its integration with the US. Probably one of the most important features of the globalization of the last few decades was global value chains, and multinationals today account for 1/3 of global output, and global value chains, primarily driven by multinationals, account for 2/3 of world trade. So in this tightly integrated world, US and China constitute two poles. US is being the major consumer market and an important corporate headquarter center, and China stands as the single most important manufacturing hub of the world. When these two largest economies of the world started to engage in a major trade war covering a wide range of goods and industries worth of 450 billion USD, we don't just expect major consequences on these economies themselves, but also on third-party nations. And Mexico emerges, as we already heard in the earlier panel, emerges as probably the most important third-party nation, bystander country in that respect. So this figure shows China's trade with the US relative to Mexico's trade with the US over the 2 decades. So we see that in 2019, Mexico outcompeted China and emerged as the #1 trade partner with the US. But let's focus on kind of smooth this figure a little bit. Let's focus on the general pattern. And we are talking about US-China decoupling these days, and its consequences on Mexico, readjustment of global value chains, associated readjustment of global value chains. 2 decades ago, we were talking about US-China coupling and incredible productivity growth that China was experiencing and China shock in the US. So I would like to a little bit go back to that coupling period to understand better what is happening today. So during this US-China coupling, global value chains were expanding towards Asia, towards China, and this rise in China's trade in the US market was at the expense of Mexico's, especially global value chain related trade of Mexico's. This shows the import share of China in US manufacturing together with Mexico's import share in US manufacturing. And you see that, China, competition with China in the US market was a big deal, was a major shock for Mexico during those times. And in an earlier work, we studied the impact on this, especially global value chain related in the industry of Mexico maquiladoras. And we showed that this was indeed an important negative shock for this industry, led to very substantial decline in plant growth, caused plant shutdowns, and large employment losses. And what we also documented that these things concentrated were on these really labor-intensive, lower value-added maquiladoras like textile, toys, and shoes. And the rise of China also transformed the structure of value chains in Mexico. So we documented the causal impact of increased competition with China in the US market on with these maquiladoras' productivity. And we documented increased adaptation of productivity enhancing management techniques in these maquiladoras and new plant entries, especially in more technology and skill intensive, higher value added sectors. So between 1999 and 2006, employment growth, normally very fast growing employment in this sector, but between these dates, there was almost no employment growth at all, but we observed significant productivity, aggregate productivity gain. And majority of this productivity gain came from between sector reallocation. Basically, resources were moving from less productive sectors like clothes, shoes, toys, to more productive modern global value chains, like global value chains that require coordination, communication, and transportation intensive sectors like automotive and chemicals. And these were also, getting more kind of modern techniques which is necessary to, survive in these new and more skill-intensive global value chains. So this table shows that, important productivity enhancing management techniques increased from 20 to 40% among these plants between 2000 and 2005. Similarly, for other important techniques necessary for required for participation in these modern global value chains, like total quality management. And these plants were also more likely to perform R&D and conduct product development. So these traditionally, that we imagine this low value added, more female labor intensive kind of plants, simple assembly plants were washed away, were not competitive enough with respect to China, but the remaining more technology intensive sectors were kind of constitute the bone of these sectors. When we come back to this decoupling period now, so that, we show that competition with China contributed importantly to this transformation happen in Mexico during those times. Now, coming back to US-China decoupling, so everybody's now again the spotlight on Mexico, and everybody is talking about, okay, Mexico will emerge as an important actor now, and we see every other day newspaper articles, talking about this. Some are optimistic, some are not all that optimistic, and arguing that Mexico misses its chance. So in a more recent work, we examined this question with using firm-level data, company-level data from Mexico that covers the universe of firms with international trade transactions. And we obtained a register of global value chain participants from the Ministry of Economy. Now they are not called maquiladoras. It's a bigger program, cover all the global value chains. It's called IMEX. We construct firm-level measures of tariff exposure. So these firms are not facing tariffs. They are the Chinese competitors are facing tariffs in the US market, and based on their pre-shock export and import portfolio, we measure these tariff exposures and conduct a causal analysis covering the period from 2015 to 2021. And we found that US tariffs on Chinese imports, Derek was complaining US policy doesn't affect anything. US policy affects Mexico's exporters. US tariffs on Chinese imports has significant positive impact on Mexican firms exporting. And this is entirely driven by global value chain firms. In particular, on average, global value chain firms increases based on 25-75 percentile exposure difference, increases export 17%. And the majority of it driven by foreign multinationals. And they also start exporting new tariff targeted products, so they add products, although we observe that this is mostly consumption products that they start exporting in response to US tariffs on Chinese goods. And as an indication for the increased domestic value added, we also documented increased net exports. So we find that this positive impact is completely driven by skill-intensive, technology-intensive industries like machinery, aerospace, which is an important industry, aerospace in Mexico, and auto parts, not like textile or apparel, the light industries that were already washed away with competition with China early on. So we also found that especially via foreign multinational subsidiaries in Mexico, that the sourcing patterns are changing. So there's also increased imports coming from Asia, not just China, also other Asian countries, and also more kind of use of the duty-free input permits that are granted by Mexican government that utilized by these firms. We find at the same time China's retaliatory tariffs have negative impact on these firms' exports, global value chain firms' exports, but magnitude-wise, this was about 7% decline. And this was more transitory, and after it was negligible after 2019, and it was heterogeneous. Mostly the negative impact concentrated on post-production services, export services that contribute in these global value chains in warehousing and distribution for the US companies. And we also look at the US-Mexico tariff escalation that was used to negotiate USMCA. We don't find major effect of this tariff escalation in global value chain trade. So this table, very briefly, I will shows that among all exporters, US tariffs on Chinese goods increased export significantly. It shows, again, 8% increase among all firms' exports to the US. And the red coefficient shows that China's retaliatory tariffs also affected these global value chains, where again, they are contributing to US companies' exports as well, that decreased their export 2%. But when we wanted to kind of distinguish the role of IMEX, global value chains, we saw that once we distinguished the effect of IMEX firms or global value chain trade, we saw that the entirety of this increase coming from, that's the right panel, coming from the IMEX or global value chain exports to the US. So that was the indication of the relocation of global value chains. When we focus on global value chain exports, this figure shows their exports to the US in response to US tariffs on Chinese goods. Again, we see on average 17% increase in firms' exports to the US. I am kind of putting this time evaluations also for you to see kind of what is happening with the COVID. You see the COVID effect, there's a little decline during the COVID time, heightened COVID time, but we see that this, effect is significant and positive by 2021, indicating that what we see here is a long-term impact. And this shows the, obviously exports increases. That is it just coming via the increased import or something added in Mexico? There's increased value added, and we show that on average there's increased domestic value added. Can we argue that because this figure shows the increased net exports at firm level net exports in response to U.S. tariffs on China? So when we look at the distribution across different industries, we see that the top shows across sectors, again, looking at the effect of U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports, the majority of benefit comes within the manufacturing. And within manufacturing, we find that these sectors like chemicals, rubber, plastic, machinery, automotive, aerospace, these were the tech-intensive, capital-intensive sectors were the biggest beneficiaries of these tariffs. And again, this shows the retaliatory tariffs of China. You may be surprised first that why do we see an effect of retaliatory tariffs of China, but there are not just manufacturing firms here, there are also warehousing firms and other firms working in the distributional channels and part of big global value chains. So we see the negative effect here coming really concentrated in those services, that type of post-production services. And when we look at agriculture, actually, agriculture seemed to benefit from China's retaliatory tariffs on US products. So in this work, we just focus on firms' trade, but as a kind of descriptive analysis, we also look at the employment growth, again, in this global value chain sector, IMEX sector, which employs about 3 million jobs, people. And the employment growth was in line with what I just described. Between 2016 and 2021, employment growth changed between 10 to 15% in those sectors that benefited, that increased their exports to the US. And similarly for the production. So there's quite a bit heterogeneity. So I mentioned that, we also map these, we know these firms, IMEX firms, and using S&P Global Database, we also identify country of ownership, and we looked at where does this positive effect coming from? We find that the majority of the positive, big response to U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods driven by foreign-owned multinationals, directly foreign multinational subsidiaries in Mexico. But the bottom figure shows the response among standalone or domestic IMEX global value chain firms, and there's also positive effect coming from them, but not as strong as the foreign multinationals. So in terms of number, these are 27% versus 10% kind of differences. So when we one aspect of nearshoring, are they just, expanding their existing product lines, or do they start also adding new products, using this opportunity with increased cost of competitors in the US market? We find that there is a little bit, extensive margin response that they, on the right, you see that these firms increasing the number of products, tariff products, targeted products that they export to the US. But when we kind of distinguish whether these goods are intermediate goods or consumption goods, we find that the most of this product dimension is driven by consumption goods. So these global value chains, if they are adding goods, then those added goods mostly consumption products that they are adding. And let me just conclude. So U.S.-China trade is super important in determining U.S.-Mexico trade. We show in the latest work that protectionist turn in the U.S. trade policy with respect to China increased Mexican firms' exports. I didn't talk about this due to time, but also increased their imports. But on average, we documented increased net exports and increased number of products. Within manufacturing, these effects are larger, so 20% increase in response to increased tariffs of U.S. tariffs on China within manufacturing. And this effect seems to be long-term in the sense that there's a little bit decline during the COVID time, but that, comes back again. And mostly in skill manufacturing, like machinery, automotive. And global value chains are responsible for this increase. And they are the entirety responsible of this trade policy spillover is the global value chain firms that we show. And nearshoring via existing companies are happening. And foreign multinationals respond stronger than local ones. But also we found that they mostly expand their existing product lines. Local ones we find, well, again, I didn't show here, but that we find that they are more likely to introduce new products, actually. And we also find more value added coming from the local GVC firms. At the same time, their sourcing patterns changes. Their input purchase from China, but also other Asian countries like Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, and India increases. And they start utilizing more duty-free permits. The Mexican government allows these firms to use, under certain circumstances, duty-free permits for their inputs from non-NAFTA or non-USMCA countries. And there's an increased utilization of these permits, and that is kind of mostly driven by the foreign multinationals rather than local global value chain firms. So these are important patterns that we need to keep an eye on. So let me just conclude. Thank you.
Excellent, Manuel.
Hi. I think it's very unfair to come from the South because that made me be the third speaker, and it's very difficult to add important things after such good presentations, but such is life. Sometimes you're not very lucky. I would like to talk about three things this morning. First of all, trilateral integration. Second, nearshoring. And finally, I would like to do some preaching about policy, if time allows me. Let me start talking about trilateral integration and its effect on Mexico. And this chart reminds of, is the chart that you usually use for placing NAFTA in terms of how successful it's supposed to be because of the volume of trade. And in this chart, you see an impressive growth of the North American trade, both intra-regional, that's the red line, and in general, the international trade. The total trade by North America has been multiplied by 5, a factor of 5, and the other one by a factor of 3. That's X plus M in nominal value. So that's something that looks pretty impressive. But if one talks about success just by the volume of trade, one should limit the happiness because at the same time, other regions in the world have been growing a little bit faster than North America. And you see that actually the North American trade in terms of total world trade has been declining in the participation of the total trade. That's the blue line. And of course, the usual suspect is China and other countries throughout this about 40 years or so that has been gaining market share. So that's the first comment I would like to make. A second comment about NAFTA and the North American trade has to do with the old concern that being NAFTA a preferential agreement, you could be afraid that perhaps NAFTA could deviate trade more than create trade. Unfortunately, there are a lot of studies, including those by Ann Krug and other people, that have shown that actually NAFTA has produced positive net trade creation. So the deviation, possible deviation, has been much smaller than the creation. And you see one of the consequences of this net creation is that actually the region has been diversifying in terms of trade outside the region. And in this chart, you see the composition of total U.S. imports according to the source countries. And what you see is a long trend of China gaining market share, which sort of is like a mirror image of what has been happening to the Canadian share. And that's sort of a reflection, a sequel of this creation of, it's not a proof of that, but it's a sort of a reflection of that. And you see also that this much celebrated, especially recently, gain in market share by Mexico. I'm going to make some comments at the end, but just recently, Mexico has become the most important country providing goods to the U.S. So it's in our country, in my country, that's quite of a pride, it's a source of pride for being the so-called the main trading partner of the largest economy in the world, which is sort of a good achievement. But and also this diversification outside the region can be seen by the composition of Mexican imports by countries. And you see that around the time when China got into the WTA, China has been gaining market share in the total Mexican imports. And that brings me this commonly heard accusation that the Chinese goods have been flooding the country recently. What you see here is that the trend of Chinese, the market share growing within the total Mexican imports has been is not a recent phenomenon, and actually during the last 3 years has stabilized. So you don't see what you usually read on the papers that the Chinese are getting into Mexico by the how do you call it, the back door. It's not actually happening, at least at the aggregate level. Maybe in some industry, sectors, but you see it's actually what has been happening is a stabilization of the importance of Chinese goods in the total imports of Mexico. That's a second message that I would like to share with you today. And the other one, The other one is that the other one is Mexico started being, before NAFTA, was a smaller economy, continues to be a smaller economy than the other two trading partners, and was a closer economy relative to Canada and the U.S. And what has been happening is a continuous growth in the openness of the Mexican economy, to the extent that right now is the most open economy in terms of total trade relative to GDP. So, and that third comment makes me ask if that opening, what are the positive effects or any effects from that rise in the openness of the country. And one of the things that you find is that you see some modernization of the Mexican economy, especially through manufacturing that is located in the states closer to the United States. So you see a different, more successful or more rapid growth, both in real GDP and real GDP per capita, relative to other states of the country. So that's good news. The other good news is that there has been some convergence of manufacturing wages. The graph is it's an amplification. It's not a total convergence. It's very far from being a convergence, but it's on the right direction of narrowing the difference vis-a-vis the United States wages in the manufacturing sector. What is worrisome is that increase or that narrowing of the gap has not been supported by narrowing of the gap in productivity in the manufacturing sector, which is the right-hand side graph. And what is perhaps the main conclusion here is that if Mexico wants to continue this convergence trend that seems to be on motion, needs to improve productivity. Otherwise, that rise may not be sustainable for too long. The bad news is that in general, talking about the well-being of the country relative to the US, there has been no convergence, there has been divergence. And that was one of the promises when Mexico signed the free trade agreement with Mexico, with the US and Canada, so that there will be a convergence in general in the well-being of the country. Up to now, there is no convergence. And of course, as happens in any economy, there are many other culprits here. It's not the fault of NAFTA, it's because we have not done enough job. Our job internally hasn't been that good in other aspects. And the other promise that NAFTA was usually predicated about was that perhaps migration could decline because of this agreement and because of the creation of trade, etc. And at this point, I should not spend too much time because the experts are here. Michael, Pia should explain this graph. But what has been happening is a decline in the net immigration of Mexicans to the United States. I think that's a long trend. Please correct me, Pia, if I'm wrong. But my impression, of course, there are many factors, benefits, in the evaluation of migrants, benefits and costs that you people have written about. But what I think is happening is that there is a decline, a secular trend in the fall in the fertility rate, and a fall in the rate at which new entrants go into the labor force in Mexico. So this pressure, this secular decline pressure has been diminishing a lot. So we are not we don't have too many people now just to send it to Mexico. That's, another graph could have been just the rate of change in the people getting into the working age population. That's also very clear, coming down. So that's I think one important factor that is going on here. But that factor doesn't have anything to do with NAFTA. Of course, stability, political stability, I think that's one factor that is not putting too many people going to the US. And also, to some extent, NAFTA helped some economic growth in the economy. So that's, to that extent, is probably contributing to the decline in migration. Let me go to the second subject, nearshoring. Here, my main message, and I think it's almost a commonplace, is that in spite of all this publicity that we hear, at least in Mexico, I think we have sort of a surplus of good predictions, a surplus of positive comments, a surplus of how much of a potential nearshoring is probably signifying for Mexico, but a deficit in real data. So we have very few data that may show up to now that some signs of nearshoring. And one of the things that you can see is that, of course, to evaluate nearshoring, we have a very short period of time, and also we had the pandemics, and we have this mixture of the upturn and the cyclical behavior. So it's very difficult to evaluate the possible impact from nearshoring into the country. But one way to evaluate is just attribute to any change that you see in trends, to everything to nearshoring. In that sense, I don't see in the manufacturing data too much reason to attribute an important impact of nearshoring, especially beginning in 2022 after the cyclical upturn. Especially, exports have been very flat during the last couple of years, manufacturing exports, which could be the main channel that you could expect from nearshoring. Also, there is another thing, talking about people, we usually talk about this gain in, so the preaching is going to be gone. Let me go faster. You talk about this all the time, this share, so Mexico being number one, the trading partner, no? So it's a share. But we seldom hear about what is the growth of the base of the total U.S. imports. What is happening here is that at least since 2022, there has been a decline in total U.S. imports. So Mexico got to be number one since the middle of last year, but of a shrinking pie. So please do not forget that. So Mexico could have been much better off being number three of a much higher pie. So it's a simple, and of course that shrinking pie doesn't provide any support to any boom coming from nearshoring. The same thing about employment in manufacturing. It has been decelerating during the last years. There is no evidence in FDI whatsoever. The FDI has continued to be mute about here. In any case, the most important component of FDI has been reinvested profits. But being constructive, you can imagine these companies operating, foreign companies operating in Mexico, perhaps because of nearshoring now reinvesting. But it's, size-wise, you don't see any boom here. So there is also no problem. Perhaps the only sign that you may find suggesting the anticipation of nearshoring is the right-hand side graph, which is suggesting a boom. Again, it's very mixed with the cyclical behavior, but an important upsurge in terms of gross fixed capital formation by the private sector. Let me go, just a couple of minutes for preaching, because that's my specialty. I cannot avoid that, because, I don't think it's very good news that the U.S. government has been involved in so much industrial policy interventions. I don't think that is good for the world. That is not good for Mexico. And one should not forget that there are always limitations for those policy interventions, including the sacrifice of opportunities for specializations. Usually the objectives got to be wider, and then you get more distortions and more inefficiencies. There is an invitation for everybody else to do the same thing that may turn out to be an excess or overcapacity for the protected sector. So there are a lot of limitations that we know that those. So my preaching, obviously, would be advisable for the U.S. to go back to its traditional role to be the leader of globalization and stop talking about globalization and deglobalization. It's the U.S. Should be in charge of leading globalization, because what is now happening is just the retaliation and imitation for this path towards geo-economic fragmentation. If this gets deeper, everybody is going to be worse off. That's my basic preaching. And talking about Mexico, it's unfortunate that we haven't done our job, because not everything was dependent on North American Free Trade Agreement. We haven't gotten the convergence to what we were hoping to have relative to income levels of the trading partners. Even the northern states, the graph that I showed is superior to the rest of the country, but the rate of growth is not stellar. So something must be wrong or deficient in my own country. That doesn't have anything to do with trade. Actually, we have had these 40 years of trade liberalization that began even before NAFTA, and what we continue to be just maquiladoras, just to be assemblers of parts. So we are not South Korea. The reason is that we are not inventing anything. We are not adding too much value added. So something must be wrong in Mexico for not to be, just to be satisfied and complacent, just to be the maquiladora country. It's the same situation in 1960. So we haven't gotten any further. So my impression is that we have been complacent, and we haven't done sufficient structural reforms to make people come and invent in the country. And finally, I don't think Mexico should expect too much from nearshoring. Actually, nearshoring could be bad luck for the country if that deepens the complacency of the country. And even that, if this decoupling gets deeper and deeper, and we are just hoping that everything is going to be regionalized, the world is going to be worse off. So Mexico, at the end, is not going to gain too much for a smaller pie. That's all. Thank you for it.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for the preaching the truth to the crowd. We have microphones on either side. We'd like to invite you to come up and line up if you have any questions. I will follow Thomas's example and take my prerogative of asking the first one, and that is that, you know, there was the sense that when NAFTA got started, that there was Europe and there was Asia, and then there would be North America, if not eventually the Americas. But, you know, neither the current leading presidential candidates have espoused this idea or really supported this idea to much degree. So I'm trying to figure out, I mean, from all these talks, it seems like all of the three of you believe that there's a value in North American integration, that there's a value of increasing production ties that would make us more competitive. So who's right here? Is it the presidential candidates or is it us, is what I'm saying? And is there still, like, how do we amplify that message if it is us who are actually correct? You see what I'm saying? So what's the value of the idea of North America, of NAFTA now? So we can start, whoever wants to go, but this is a question for all three.
Well, you ask the hardest question first. You should start with a nice, easy one. But no, I think, I think the evidence is pretty clear. And even though probably the biggest challenge politically is all the problems can be put on NAFTA, or not all the problems, but often it's blamed for things. And maybe the expectations set up ahead of time. Like in all three countries, the politicians that pushed for integration, you know, in Canada, the prime minister that basically had a referendum on free trade in 1988, his slogan was jobs, jobs, jobs. And the same slogan was in the US. So this promise of jobs, I think politically, first of all, there's adjustments that happen, not necessarily, you know, and we know in theory we shouldn't be seeing a change in the unemployment rate or the employment rate. We do know that people lose jobs, and so that's a very difficult thing. And politically, it's very difficult. And as all the evidence on the China shock shows, I think one interesting thing to me is that with the China shock literature, the challenge of adjusting to a change that we expect happens, at least in the long run, doesn't seem to happen very much at all in the US over a very long period of time. It did happen more in Canada, and Canada had to adjust a lot from the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. A lot of plants closed, a lot of jobs were lost, unemployment in certain areas, geographic areas, increased, but the transition happened there. I mean, that goes back to NAFTA. With the China shock, Canada didn't seem to be hit as hard in that sense. So it's interesting about the adjustment, but I do think expectations, and how do you sell a trade agreement politically? You always put it back to jobs, and there shouldn't be an expectation that happens. So then, how did we do? Well, we didn't really create any jobs. Okay, so it's a tough one, but I do think that we're right, and the politicians need to listen to us more.
Well, of course we are right. I mean, that's out of the question. Only because politicians have all other objectives or whatever. But in talking about Mexico, fortunately, we have a very social consensus among the population that trade openness was good for the country. So that is not an issue even for politicians. It's not an idea or a thesis that a politician would defend just to close the economy. As I said in the last part of the presentation, the thing here is that perhaps the trade openness and its benefits made Mexicans a little lazy for expecting a lot of luck, because of the luck of being the neighbor of the largest economy in the world. We seem to continue expecting everything from good luck. But in terms of the politics, I think there was a very good selling of NAFTA, and that part permeated for good among people in Mexico. So that's and we used to see the China inclusion into the World Trade Organization as bad news, but not anymore now. So I think it's very fertile territory at this moment in Mexico to continue praising trade, and there is no opposition for our ideas.
Trade is great, but that greatness comes with price changes, and that those price changes and that greatness associate with reallocation of resources. And we shouldn't ignore or disregard this important fact. Trade has important distributional consequences. So probably weak support for NAFTA or also previously with China, obviously driven by these not addressing properly these distributional consequences, because the benefits are more kind of distributed with these decline in prices we all experience, but not in an, if you are losing your job, obviously that you really feel that, and that is in a really concentrated group. So we cannot ignore that. That greatness has cost, and if you are not addressing this cost, obviously you will lose some political support. But also there's an extra benefit from North American integration when we in this political climate with issues with China. That is a big and more stable alternative.
We'll start on the right.
Hello, Edward Opa, Dallas, Texas. I have a question. I have two questions. Are we substituting colonization with globalization? Because, you have 200 countries in the world, and you hear about G7 and G20. And so since we have been doing the globalization, we haven't had many countries migrate to this level of developed economies. And then for the Mexican and Canadian folks here, how come there's a disparity between the peso exchange rate to the dollar and then the Canadian dollar to the US dollar? When you look at the trade factors, because at the end of the day, the people in each country has to have the purchasing power using their local currency. So the Mexican exchange rate to the dollar is almost 17-1, and then in the Canada it's less than that. Can you guys explain what is driving this disparity? And despite the fact that Americans prefer to go to Mexico for vacation, because I don't go to Canada, it's too cold. But with that, because that's tourism, and that's still more money to Mexico. How come the peso is not edging towards 1-to-1 to the dollar?
Thank you. Anyone?
Well, I have to defend Canadian tourism, first of all. A lot of Americans come to Canada. There's where I live, there's about 11 months of winter and 1 month of lousy baseball weather. So it's a great place to come. No, actually, tourism is a massive industry in Canada and in different parts. I don't have much to say about the peso and the exchange rate, but on the colonization with globalization, that's a big issue, a big question. I do think globalization is more about firms, but maybe we just replace governments with multinationals. But I think there's a big difference between countries that are going in and I think there's bigger issues with sovereignty and that kind of thing. And I do think, I haven't looked at the data recently, but countries have moved up, countries have emerged. So I would push back on that. I don't think it's true that countries have stayed behind. And if you look at the data, countries that haven't evolved, or if you look at the the countries that have done less well, they're more likely to be less engaged in globalizations, and the ones that have been engaged in globalizations are ones that have moved up. So I would push back on that assertion.
If you want to think about what is going on with the Mexican peso, if I understood the question correct. You asked the question? Yes. Yeah. No, we have plenty of theories about exchange rates, but we hardly, any of those theories hardly predict or explain fully what is going on, especially in the short term of any currency, including the peso. But talking about specifically about the Mexican peso, one usually expect, or is common to expect, flows within the balance of payments. So you think that Mexican peso appreciation has anything to do with inflows, important inflows of the balance of payments. Or, for instance, the strength of people coming from tourism into the country. But one has to remember that currency, particularly the Mexican peso, is one of the most traded, globally traded currency. We were talking about that yesterday. And it happens to be that about 70% or so, I don't remember the percentage, of the total exchange in the spot and also the derivative market for the Mexican peso happens between two counterparts that are domiciled outside the country. You know, somebody in London and the other counterpart in South Africa or something. So you don't see too much relationship between flows in the balance of payments and these bets that the people outside the country may be doing. So what the basics of any appreciation of any currency eventually goes to too many people liking that currency. And why, particularly during the last couple of years, many people are betting in favor of the Mexican peso may have something to do with this hype related to nearshoring. In Mexico, it's like we are living the Mexican moment. So, but that's something that may be transitory, that doesn't have anything to do with the flows of tourism or anything, and maybe just something that may not last unless nearshoring can show more support in the actual data.
Everything is said already, so nothing for me to add, really. But the globalization lifted many millions of people out of poverty, and I do not think that we are replacing globalization with colonization. But at the same time, power balance may be an important consideration here. You know, multinationals' power in developing countries and you know, other types of power balances. Yeah, I think nothing. Everything is said already.
I'm Stuart Jones. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank Jim for bringing it all together. My question would be for Mr. Sanchez, and with regard to your address and your last policy slide, the one that was Mexico policy, the last 2 points bring up potential structural policy reforms, and the last point similar. How would you say the two candidates now for president coming up in June, Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl, how will each of them take advantage of those potential structural policy reforms?
That's a very timely question, very difficult to answer. As good politicians, both the leading candidates have not said anything, almost anything about structural reforms. They are just competing in how much money they are going to transfer to the potential voters. That's something perhaps something expected from politicians that are trying to attract votes. But if one could imagine, because the agenda or the policy agenda hasn't been exposed clearly by the two leading candidates yet. There have been some writing or something, but they have not been that explicit in the first, for instance, in the first presidential debate that we just had last week. It was just a bunch of accusations going from one side to the other. So you don't have actual facts just to infer or to deduce that which candidate is going to be more pushing towards structural reforms. But just reading out of the background of the two candidates, it's obvious that the opposition candidate comes from a business environment, has some economic advisors that are favorable for structural reforms. So that's is rational to expect that the opposition candidate will be much more favorable towards an agenda of structural reforms, and the other candidate, the official candidate, will be just the status quo, to continue actually moving towards, it's similar to what we just said about globalization, that since the trade war started just reversing this trend towards globalization. It's something similar that has happening in my country. Just the movement towards the modernization of the country stopped during this administration, actually reversed important reforms, and that provided uncertainty. Is not good for the country and the country's prospect.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question to Jim Hollifield, Director of the Tower Center, is also for Manuel Sanchez. And I know Raymond has thought about this, but what's wrong with productivity of labor in Mexico? Why does the productivity of Mexican labor not improve?
That is difficult. But one could conjecture that it's a commonplace kind of an answer that I'm going to give you. Education has been really a dragging factor in Mexico for such a long time. I mean, it's getting the public education system has gotten worse and worse through the years. And a lot of people, actually, when one talks about the famous nearshoring, usually people say, well, we don't have skilled labor to manage this significant inflow of FDI that is going to come eventually into the country. So I will resort to the commonplace kind of response. I mean, our formation of human capital is extremely weak. So companies train people to do exactly the job they are supposed to do, and actually the armadoras, or how do you say armadoras? I mean, the factories in the maquiladora industry are well known as being efficient and all that, but those are like spots, isolated spots in the country, because in general there is a limitation in terms of skill, the skilled labor. So it's sort of like a drag, a continuous drag for productivity in manufacturing and also services and other sectors of the economy.
I just want to be respectful of everyone's time and the schedule. So we have two more people for questions. We'll take them both, I think. We'll start with Mr. Clemens, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll just let the panel respond to those, and we'll wrap up. Does that sound good? Great.
Thank you so much, Michael Clemens, George Mason University. Last night I threw up a paper on the screen by Raymond and cited it as Hansen et al. So just to try to make up for that, I want to offer an insight on, well, a perspective now And it won't surprise you that I want to inject migration into this discussion. I was really struck by Manuel Sanchez's data suggesting that past efforts, integration efforts in North America arising from NAFTA may have pursued comparative advantage, but don't seem to have changed comparative advantage. And scholars working at the intersection of trade and migration, like Danny Bahar, have investigated what is it that changes comparative advantage in countries. They have a paper in the Economic Journal, Danny Bahar and Hâle Rappaport, asking when is it exactly that countries start to produce and export categories of goods, specific categories of goods that they've never produced and exported before, and they find a very strong association between that and migration, especially high-skill migration. Bilateral stocks of high-skill migration are strongly associated with shifting comparative advantage of the kind that we want, that you want from NAFTA, USMCA. So I know people who are involved in the negotiations. They told me back in the early 1990s from the US side, there was the blanket declaration that if there's any provision, major provision for migration in this agreement, we're leaving. And that's why we ended up with what Land Pritchett calls everything but labor globalization, as an instance of that in NAFTA. So my question is a broad one, which are the disappointing results in terms of long-term shifts of Mexico's comparative advantage and an example of globalization gone too far and disappointing results, or an example of globalization not going far enough, and I would say particularly on labor.
Globalization not going far enough, but not the main culprit. I'm very convinced that we have done a terrible job in terms of domestic policies. So actually, a lot of people say that the Mexican economy has been growing in spite of everything that the government, or most of the things that the government is trying to do just to make it hard for opening a company and for foreigners to come in and invest. And I think we need more net immigration of high-skilled labor, because Mexico is not importing too much human capital. So if we don't have enough of that resource, I wish we had more of that. I mean, we have a lot of low-skilled labor. That's the abundant factor. But it's not, it's absolute, I think it will be a mistake to blame globalization. It's the other way around.
We're going to go ahead and take this other question, so I'll make sure we hear your question.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm a little short for this microphone. But the thing I have not heard any discussion about that I always think of when I think of Mexico is cartels. And I think they have to have an effect on whether people can be trained, whether highly trained people want to go and live in Mexico, and why people are so anxious to leave and leave everything behind to go somewhere where they're not in danger.
Raymond is going to answer in my name, because that's a very easy question.
We'll start with you. We'll start with the panelists.
Put your mic.
You asked about cartels, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit worked on that. How business environment is impacted by organized crime, and the main kind of findings I found that first of all, it's a major effect, and the impact of the way businesses are impacted usually coming via the labor market. So crime has an important impact, especially low-income part of the society, and that has that causes non-participation and affects manufacturing, especially domestic market-oriented, small-scale manufacturing. It doesn't have super important impact on more tech-intensive, capital-intensive, or foreign company operations in Mexico. Maybe that is why we don't talk about it much, but firms start small and develop capability and grow. So that chain is kind of broken in Mexico, from my understanding. So, developing domestic capability from scratch and cartels, organized crime has really important effect on this chain.
I want to thank all the panelists, and thank you all very much for your questions, your participation. Please join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent session.